We're fortunate to be hosted by Tylers Museum, Holland's oldest museum, triumph of the Dutch Enlightenment, established in 1784 and one of the gems of Haarlem, which happens to be one of my favorite cities. My name is Wiep van Buggen. I'm a professor of the history of philosophy. I'm fascinated by the history of philosophy because I'm fascinated by the simple question why we think in the way that we do. Where do our ideas, our views come from? Are we perhaps able to account for the way in which our ideas and our views change in the way that they do? I'm not at all sure we are able to explain such changes, but what we can do is listen very closely to the way in which our ancestors addressed the same topics facing us today. Today, few concepts are as hotly contested as the concept of democracy. In Europe and the United States, it was only during the 18th century that it became popular once again, some 2,000 years after the first democratic experiments had been held in ancient Greece, and more in particular in Athens. While most of us continue to consider the use of the term undemocratic as an essentially critical gesture, few of us will be ready to agree that today's democracies are going particularly well. Democracy is supposed to mean government by the people, but both in Europe and in the United States, considerable parts of the population have come to distrust and even despise democracy as we know it. Just read the papers. Anti-politicians are more popular than ever. In 2016, a businessman was elected President of the United States of America. While left-wing activists point out that today's politicians fail to implement measures protecting our common interests in a sustainable economy, right-wing populists argue that politicians fail to protect the special interests of local populations facing globalization and its effects. These developments are only further enhanced by a growing rift between the educated and the non-educated sections of the population. For some time now, sociologists have been warning us for the social and political consequences of the mutual distrust resulting from this rift. Now, democracy has always been a contested concept. In the history of political thought, it was hardly ever taken seriously before the 17th and 18th centuries, that is, before Spinoza and Rousseau, who incidentally rejected representative democracy. According to Rousseau, only a direct democracy involving the population itself would be able to forestall the risk of the rise of a political class cultivating interests of their own. Politicians like to muse about the noble Greek origins of the concept, but they forget to tell you that Athens did not have a representative democracy at all. Instead, it was ruled by a direct democracy involving only the free-born male adult population. As a matter of fact, our representative democracies owe much more to such Roman institutions as the tribunes speaking in the Senate on behalf of the plebs, and to such medieval organizations as guilds and estates. In this cause, we're not so much concerned with the historical origins of democracy as we know it today. Instead, we'll be discussing the way in which Greek philosophers, in their analysis of democracy as they knew it, articulated the relationship between politics and skepticism. It all begins with Protagoras, a leading 5th century sophist. For ever since Plato, to be called a sophist was to be insulted. In Homer, it simply means a wise man. But by the time Greek teachers came to instruct the Romans, it had become indeed an insult. As Protagoras' writings were burned and only some fragments survived, it is difficult to assess his views, but Plato was adamant. Protagoras actively supported Athenian democracy. Plato tells us so in a dialogue entitled Protagoras, according to which this professional teacher taught that all human beings are equipped with the ability to take part in the political process. From several other sources, however, we learn that Protagoras also felt that reason is very fragile. It was said that Protagoras felt, and I quote, that there are two sides to every question. Protagoras had also argued that everybody has his own truth, so contradictions are impossible. And it would seem Protagoras was something of a proto-skeptic, Protagoras was especially concerned to counter the claims made by pre-Socratic natural philosophers. Having been a pupil of the atomist philosopher Democritus, Protagoras appears to have grown skeptical about the largely speculative nature of philosophy as he knew it. If we take a closer look at other Greek sophists, we see them all battling, especially with Parmenides' claims about the existence of a reality beyond the senses and our ability to access this reality with the exclusive use of reason. Some appear to have reverted to complete skepticism, denying the possibility to say anything meaningful about reality as our senses fail us all the time and as reason itself is equally feeble. But even Plato agreed that Protagoras was no complete skeptic in political philosophy. He tells us so in the Theaetetus. When it comes to affairs of state, we are able to distinguish between better or worse, on strictly pragmatic grounds. So Protagoras appears to have looked upon politicians as medical doctors. Plato, on the other hand, expected more from political philosophy, as he felt that politicians should practice the art of politics instructed by their insight into the essence of justice, which in turn presupposed the knowledge of justice, that is, access to the idea of the good. In fact, Plato's theory of ideas was very much a rebuttal of the skepticism prevalent among the sophists he despised so much. True knowledge is possible, Plato kept arguing, but it's simply too demanding for the common man, let alone woman, to lead a life dedicated to the contemplation of the essence of, for instance, justice. So unlike Protagoras, Plato felt not all people were equipped with the abilities to take part in the political process. In fact, it has been argued that Plato's rejection of Athenian democracy was very much part of an aristocratic backlash against the rise of the merchant classes in 6th and 5th century Athens. Plato's ancestors had been robbed of their political privileges by Solon's 6th century legal reforms. But let's for now return to the political dimension of Greek skepticism. If Protagoras was indeed A subjectivist, B, a pragmatist, and C, a man who essentially revolted against the impossible dilemma resulting from pre-Socratic natural philosophy and the incipients in Parmenides of Greek metaphysics, it makes perfect sense to conclude that apparently he felt there was a crucial difference between metaphysics and politics. Plato refused to make any such distinction, and 20th century commentators were quick to point out the dangerous consequences of Plato's rejection of democracy. In particular, Karl Popper's analysis soon turned into something of a succès de scandale. It is contained in the first volume of his two-part The Open Society and Its Enemies, a book Popper wrote during the Second World War in order to trace the origins of totalitarianism. In our next clip, we'll be discussing Popper's assessment of Plato's rejection of democracy. It's one thing to hear a professor talk about Aristotle and Plato, but there's nothing like reading the great philosophers. So please read Plato, Protagoras 317e, 328d, of which major 17th century British political philosopher does this passage remind you, and why? Second question. Please read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics 369 on courage. Now, what, according to Aristotle, does courage tell us about the virtues?